This week here in Minneapolis and across the country, the winds were blowing. Perhaps you've noticed that day where it reached 103 degrees here, and you stepped outside and were met by that fiery blast of air. In a sense, slapping you in the face, waking you up to the heat of the day. Now, there were other winds blowing too on the internet. You see, one of our political leaders had made comments about Paul Revere and how he was going to warn the British. And after that, that set off a firestorm in our country. And the next thing you know, there were people going to Wikipedia to change the story of history, and then others going in to change it back. And soon they had to lock down the Wikipedia website because it seemed like everyone was trying to tell the story of Paul Revere. Now, I loved what happened, and I love the conversation that took place afterwards because it invites us into a conversation of narrative, of history, and of story. And if some of you read the editorial in the Star Tribune on Thursday, there was Jack Schneider, a professor at Carleton College down in Northfield, that other school across the river. And there he wrote about how each of us is given a narrative of how history has transpired. And he talked about Sarah Palin and her work with this story, which was then later reframed to say that, as she said, Paul Revere rode to warn the British that they could not take away the guns. And then you have us who perhaps grew up in elementary school and learned the narrative or the story passed on by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow of Paul Revere's Ride, where he was crouched in the bushes or the trees watching, waiting to see the lanterns from the steeple. One if by land, two if by sea. We were given a narrative in our elementary school about Paul Revere and his midnight ride. Now, neither are completely true. Both have elements of truth that invite us into story. And as we come to this day of Pentecost, we are invited to step back, to recognize that there is an incredible narrative before us. One that invites us into the story on many levels, that holds many truths and many understandings, and calls us to some universal or larger understandings of life and our following in the ways of Jesus and the Spirit that is sent among us. Let's back up first, though, to the beginning. You see, if we are to begin with Pentecost, it is important for us to step back to the very foundation of who we are as people and people created by this Holy One of Israel. You see, at the very beginning in Genesis 1, we are told that in the beginning there was God. And there was this dark and formless void, and the Spirit blew over the face of the earth. The Spirit blew, creating right there at the beginning something new and profound. Something wonderful that, as it goes on throughout the story, is said to be good. And by the time we get to humanity, we hear that it is very good. As we come this day and we hear of the Spirit blowing, we are invited back into that narrative. That something new and profound is taking shape in a room in the upstairs in Palestine. That there in that room, as the apostles gather, a new thing is happening. Wonderful. Powerful. There. We are also invited into the narrative or the story of Moses. This one who is the great prophet of the people of Israel. You see, it is in Moses' call that there is the burning bush there ahead of him. The fire, the tongues that do not consume the bush, but rather enlighten him and lighten the path in which he is to travel. As people of the Jewish faith, as they heard the story of Pentecost, there was this narrative of those Jews in that place and that time encountering this Spirit in the flames that light upon them. That they are now a part of history in a new and wonderful way, just as their ancestor in faith, this incredible prophet Moses. Now God's Spirit in fire has encountered them, has laid claim to what they are to be about and where they are to go. And then there is this other messier narrative that also gets brought in. Some of you perhaps remember the Tower of Babel, of people working to build up this tower to reach the heavens and to touch the holy. How often do we attempt that same thing? We want to be like God. Whether it is in accumulating wealth or knowledge, reaching the stars or the outer limits of space. But it is there that as the story goes, the tower crumbles and people are dispersed throughout the world, speaking a variety of languages. From that attempt to be like God comes this incredible diversity and a reminder that we are not God, but rather our people, on our own journeys, our own struggles, now with our own languages. But it is precisely here on Pentecost that we are invited back into that narrative, that to say that God calls us back together, to do something new and incredible and wonderful. That the languages which have divided can now be a place of coming together and having people speak to one another in new ways. Rather than us being like God, God invites us into the conversation of how we might live God's mission, being followers of the Spirit and of this one, this Christ, who claims us in new life. That is another part of the narrative for today. Now there is also a piece of the narrative that we often miss out on as Christians. That this is an agricultural festival. That this Pentecost was 50 days, 7 weeks after the Passover. And it was after the spring harvest, the harvest of the spring wheat. And there they would have a celebration of people coming together with the new fruits of the spring season. And they would send out fire signals into the air to let people know of the celebration and what was happening. And people would come together to party, to live richly in the gifts of that spring. Oftentimes we neglect this part because most of us are not of a historic or Jewish tradition. That we forget the Festival of Weeks and how we are called into this party and celebration and fireworks, in a sense, being set off that call us again to community and spring renewal.